quick, where does the biblical figure of Satan actually live? My name's Ken. I'm a full-time missionary. It's been abroad for 5 years. Also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially religious history. And I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. But where does Satan make his humble abode? We have plenty of images and media portrayals, right? Satan as the overlord of hell, smelling of fire and brimstone with devious torches designed to torment the damned. Or have you ever been exposed to one of those indoctrination skits that fundamentalist churches put on around Halloween, like Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames, designed to terrify you into professing Christ as Lord and Savior, to spare you from an eternity of being gleefully roasted by Satan and his evil cohorts? Scary stuff. And fear of torment does prove to be a much more potent driver of emotional response than, say, love. But I want you to take a minute and find me a Bible verse that backs any of those ideas up. In fact, I want you to find me a Bible verse that says that Satan, right now, is in the realm of hell, torturing others. Just put this on pause, look in your Bible, or do a quick internet search and find one. What's that? The closest you could find was a mention of a few sinful angels bound in chains of darkness until judgment in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 1:6, and references as to what would happen to the figure of Satan at the end of days in Revelation. But do those verses depict Satan as the Mac Daddy of hell, aka Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, or Tartarus? You know, for a guy that we've been indoctrinated to think is the king of hell, the Bible doesn't say a single thing about him or his cohorts having any dominion there. In fact, and hold on to your seats here, the whole idea of a person being met at the gates of the afterlife by Satan and sentenced to an eternity of tortures, it's not a biblical concept, but it is firmly rooted in Mediterranean and Near East pagan religions and medieval and Renaissance philosophy. In fact, scriptural evidence of Satan residing in a traditional concept of hell do not exist. No passages depict Satan holding court in a fiery furnace or underworld where judgment takes place. And that's because, according to the Bible, Satan isn't in hell at all. At least, not yet. So where is this guy? Us Christians believe the first place we see Satan is in the garden, right? And we believe that because the writer of Revelation 12 identifies the serpent in Genesis as Satan. But Jewish folks might argue with you a little there, but that's another vid for another day. So anywho, from a Christian perspective, Satan is the serpent in the garden, more crafty than any other beast of the field. So Satan's first appearance is on earth, and God's curse in Genesis 3:14 binds him to the earth, commanding him to eat dust, yo. Later, Satan makes a grand appearance in the book of Job, where he joins the heavenly hosts. In heaven, by the way, not on a Zoom call from hell, for a meeting with Yahweh. And God inquires about Satan's whereabouts, to which Satan responds, just hanging on earth, taking a leisurely stroll, causing some probs. This further emphasizes Satan's presence on earth, not in the fiery underworld. And in the Old Testament, the only other passages referencing Satan is in Zechariah 3:1-3 in a phenomenal vision. The location's unclear, but it shows Satan accusing Joshua the high priest while standing at his right hand. But again, this vision does not provide evidence of a traditional concept of a fiery hell, but Satan is more of a member of the divine council, playing the role of accuser, or prosecutor, so to speak. And you can make an argument Satan is mentioned in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, but he's not mentioned directly as Satan. And he's definitely not in a place of fiery flames, being a shot caller, baller, brawler, who be dipping in the bins with a spoiler. Got a shout out to my late 90s radio listeners here. In the New Testament, first place we see Satan popping up is on earth, tempting Jesus in the wilderness, Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4. And during Jesus' ministry, Satan is portrayed as actively present on earth and is never referred to as being in hell. Even the demons who Jesus casts out of the man, or men of the Gadarenes, say, "Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Meaning, they aren't in hell either. In fact, all of Jesus' interactions with demonic forces happen on earth. After Jesus' ascension, the New Testament warns of Satan's present dealings with us on earth rather than potential future dealings in hell. We're advised to resist anger and sin to avoid giving Satan an opportunity, and that's Ephesians 4:27, and to put on the full armor of God to stand against his schemes, and that's Ephesians 6. And Paul twice tells Timothy to beware of Satan's traps, 1 Timothy 3 and 2 Timothy 2, while James and Peter tell their churches to resist the devil, James 4 and 1 Peter 5. And Peter describes Satan as a prowling lion, seeking to devour on earth, 1 Peter 5:8. It's pretty clear that the New Testament reveals Satan holds power on earth, and not in a realm called hell. He helps cause evil, temptation, destruction, and death on earth, making hell present on earth in a way, and he operates in a heavenly realm according to Ephesians. But the good news of Jesus disempowers this being so that we may know the love of Jesus upon earth and reveal God's kingdom to others. And Satan's future, as revealed in Revelation, is to be cast to a place he's never been, hell, where he will be punished. But Satan will not rule there, nor will he be doling out punishments from a throne, as the place was created to punish Satan and the demons. And that's Matthew 25:41. Not to give them a kingdom to rule, where it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So, where did the idea that Satan is the big kahuna in hell, smelling of sulfur and brimstone, come from? Because it's obviously not biblical. And what does this mean about people's visions and stories of hell throughout the ages and even today? Well, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be discussing this wild topic, and it's pretty wild, where we're going to get away from the sensationalism and get down to the facts about the history of hell in the Christian faith. So I hope you stick around and check it out, because it's going to be very enlightening, especially if you've only heard about hell from an evangelical perspective or from popular media. It's time to leave the conspiracies and the fear behind and get to the truth of not just hell, but of God's love for you and all of creation. Quick! When I say the word hell, what pops into your brain? Eternal fire? Tormenting flames, a place of outer darkness separate from God, unending torture and punishment, a place with Cotton Eye Joe on endless repeat while you're forced to do the chicken dance for all time by a pitchfork-wielding piggy-faced demon. Or is it a made-up place created to control the masses? Facts are, a lot of things come to mind when we hear the word hell. That really depends on your religious tradition and disposition. And even from a Christian perspective, there are tons of different ways folks look at the bad place people might go to after they die. But what does the Bible actually say about hell? And how has this idea of hell changed throughout the centuries? The answers might surprise you. So let's do this. Let's get away from the sensationalism, disinformation, and the misdirection, and get down to the hard facts about the history of hell in the Christian faith. And oh yeah, hi. In case we've never met, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history. And I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. And if we've met before, what's up? This is the second video of a series on hell in the Christian faith. And as this whole thing deserves more than a few 4 or 5 minute videos, we're going to spread it out a bit over the next few weeks. A few days ago, we kicked this thing off with a bang, and using the Bible, blew to bits this idea that hell is the ruling place of Satan and his demons. And if you haven't seen that video, check it out. But now that we've proven that Satan and the demons are not in hell as we traditionally think about hell, let's dive deeper into this word translated to us as HE double hockey sticks. But a few things. Take a deep breath, because these videos might mess with your brain. There are a lot of things that some of us have been taught over our lives that aren't necessarily correct. And it's okay if you get a little upset. It really is. I get it. These videos are not meant to upset you. If anything, these videos are like that pill in the Matrix, okay? You can choose to not change your thoughts about hell, or you can choose to go through the looking glass and see how deep this thing goes. Either way, you're free to choose. So scroll away or hang on tight. Are you ready? Okay. Now this part's for my fellow Christians. I know we like to think that how we think about things now is how things have always been thought about. But even a cursory glance at history shows this isn't the case. And if you're interested in that history of how things like the Bible came to be and the moments behind its creation, please check out some of the classes I offer online, as I don't have time to get into too much of that here. But know this, just like there are many ideas about hell and what's going on in hell today, there was just as much debate in the days when the books of this book were being written. And that's a historic, verifiable fact. That's right, even the writers of the Bible had different ideas of what hell and the afterlife actually were. And that's because the books of this book, which I personally believe are divinely inspired, are multivocal and were composed over a period of 1,500 or so years. Now, think about how your thought life of the world and what's in it is completely different from a person that lived in Rome 1,500 years ago. Shoot, try to imagine someone's thought life 200 years ago. Your understanding of the world is completely different. It was the same way for the writer of Revelation and the composer of the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, separated by maybe 1,300 odd years. These writers of the books of the Bible had very different understandings of God's role in their lives and how God interacted with creation, who God actually was, what God wanted. These writers had different understandings of their history, their culture, their place in the world through famines, wars, disasters, exile, invasions. The world of the Bible was not static, and neither is this holy book. And yes, the idea of what we now call hell did change and has continued to change over the last few thousand years. So here are the basics which we're going to dive into over the next few weeks. In the King James Version of the Bible, the word hell is mentioned 54 times, 31 times in the Old Testament, 23 times in the New Testament. See fiery flames throughout, burn baby burn. There's a lot of hell up in that Bible. But, and here's a problem, the word translated as hell in the KJV is actually 4 different words. Sheol in the Old Testament, and Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus in the New. And technically, there's a 5th word that some use interchangeably for hell, the Hebrew word Abaddon. But in the Old Testament, Abaddon is kind of a supernatural realm set apart for destruction and those who cause destruction. And it's mentioned 5 times, Job 26, 28, and 31, once in Psalm 88, and in Proverbs 15:27. But in Revelation 9, something neat happens to Abaddon. The meaning of Abaddon has evolved. Is no longer just a place, but Abaddon becomes the angel of the abyss, who's the king of a plague of mutant locusts unleashed upon the world at the end of days. But in its original Hebraic meaning, Abaddon wasn't hell like we think of it, but a bottomless pit that was either next to Sheol, the resting place of the dead, or a compartment within Sheol, especially as we get closer to the Second Temple era. But all of that's for a later video, so don't worry about it right now. But when it comes to the 4 words often translated as hell in the KJV, Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus, each word means different things depending on the placement and contexts it's being used. And none of them exactly mean what our modern concept of hell means. Dum, dum, dum. Now, do not hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying hell doesn't exist. This concept of a place of punishment or cleansing or whatever you want to call it, it's there in the Bible. But what I am saying is that our modern idea of what hell isn't what the ancients may have thought it was. And because of this, more recent translations of the Bible are moving away from the overarching hell translation and going back to the words that were translated into hell. Not because the translators have become more progressive or disbelieve the Bible or anything like that, but because they are moving to a more accurate rendering of the original texts. So in the KJV Old Testament, where hell is mentioned 31 times, in the Hebrew Bible, the ASV, the Amplified Bible, the CJB, the ESV, the HCSB, the JPSB, the Jewish Publication Society, Tanakh, the NASB, the NET, the NIV, the REB, and the RSV, and a whole bunch of others, hell is no longer used and not mentioned even once in the Old Testament. Yeah, Ken, well, that's the Old Testament, and as Christians, we're under the New Covenant, and Jesus used the word hell. And that's cool, but while the 1611 and 1885 KJV used the word hell 23 times in the New Testament, once again, more recent translations are going back to the original Greek terms, with these translations using the word hell 14 times or less. The ASV, the Amplified, NASB, NCV, NIV, NLT, NRSV, REB, and the RSV, and even the New King James Version, the NKJV, the most popular Bible in America, using the word hell less than 14 times. And some translations don't use the word hell at all anymore. The NAB, the WEB, the YLT, and a host of others. So now that we know that the word that we translate as hell is actually a number of different words, even according to the New King James Version, what do those words tell us specifically about hell? Well, stay tuned for part 3, because we're going to start with the Old Testament and we're going to crack open Sheol, the subterranean underworld where the souls of the dead, both righteous and unrighteous, went after the body died. It's a bit gloomy, but don't worry, we'll punch it up. So today we're jumping back into our discussion of the history of hell in the Christian faith because, oh baby, hell as a concept has a long history whose meaning has changed a lot over time. And since this is video 3 and we've set the ground rules in the prior 2 videos, we're just going to crack on. And remember, this series isn't about disproving the existence of hell, proving the existence of hell, or anything like that. So if you're looking for a turn and burn, you won't find that here. And today we're going to talk about a word in the Old Testament that no major modern translations, with the exception of one, but that one translation is a doozy, still translate as hell. And that is Sheol. And oh yeah, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time Jesus-loving non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history, and I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. So, let's talk about Sheol, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the sleeping and the resting that may be. I gotta keep it real for my 90s and double aughts kids. Can't stop, won't stop. But in the Old Testament, a word that some Bibles translate as hell doesn't really mean what we think of when we think of the word hell. And this word is Sheol. The Hebrew word Sheol is used in the Old Testament around 65, 66 times, depending on translation. And the King James, along with the New King James, is the only major translation that still translates Sheol as hell in the Old Testament. Every other major modern translation has moved to a more accurate rendering of the original text, replacing mentions of hell in the Old Testament with the appropriate source word. This isn't a progressive thing. It's not a postmodern thing. This is presenting a more accurate translation based upon available ancient texts. But since most folks in the States are more familiar with the King James, I'll mention that the KJV translates Sheol as grave 31 times, hell 31 times, and pit 3 times. Again, however, ancient texts and modern widely used translations do not translate Sheol as hell in the Old Testament, and I will say it again and again. And the Hebrew Bible does not translate Sheol as hell either. Instead of a fiery furnace, which is what we typically think of when we hear the word hell, Sheol refers to the grave, or the domain of the dead. And while the concept of Sheol changes a bit throughout the Old Testament, especially as we get closer to the Hellenistic and intertestamental periods, in a nutshell, in the afterlife, Sheol was the place where, after death, all souls went. Every soul, according to Psalm 49. And that means both good and bad, righteous and unrighteous, according to Ecclesiastes 9. Sheol was situated in the bowels of the earth, according to Deuteronomy 32, 1 Samuel 28, Job 26, Psalm 86, Isaiah 7, and Ezekiel 31. And Sheol was your destiny. It's where you were going, no questions asked, and that's Psalm 49 and 89. Now remember what I said in the last video. When you're looking at biblical texts, which I do personally believe are divinely inspired, you're looking at a collection of works from different time periods, cultural understandings, and people groups. So that means there were different ideas of what Sheol actually was. We make a grave mistake. Get it? Grave, Sheol. I'll stop. When we think that ancient peoples believed the same exact things we do, and that these beliefs followed a linear path from thousands of years ago to the present day. The religion and beliefs of the ancient Israelites and those of ancient Judaism was actually quite different, just as the early Judaic beliefs of those in the exilic period were different than that of those under a more Hellenistic influence during Jesus' day. And in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's obvious that the concept of Sheol changed, or at least the ancients' understanding of Sheol changed. In earliest forms, it appears that there's much in common with the Hebraic idea of Sheol and the afterlife of other Mesopotamian cultures. And like the other ancient cultures, Israelites believed in keeping the graves of families and tribes together. So the use of Sheol infers that it was the common grave of all humanity, like a big family tomb of mankind deep in the earth. And at least early on, one thing that was great about the afterlife in Sheol was that there was no hate, anger, or work. But the bad thing is that there's no love, knowledge, or wisdom, and that's Ecclesiastes 9. There's no sound either, according to Psalm 94 and 115, which also means there's no worship of God, and that's Psalm 6, 30, 88, and 115. And Isaiah 38, Job 10, Job 17, Psalm 88, and 143 say there's no light in Sheol. There's also no memories in Sheol, according to Psalm 6, 88, and Ecclesiastes 9. And in its earliest form, Sheol isn't even used as a place of punishment after death. Psalm 6, Isaiah 38, and Ecclesiastes 9, in fact, speak of it as a realm of unconsciousness, of sleeping, of resting with your family. And some biblical writers even believe that the inhabitants of Sheol could, under some circumstances, be summoned by the living, as when the witch of Endor calls up the spirit of Samuel for Saul. And while it wasn't a pleasurable idea to go to Sheol, sometimes it was considered a better state than life, like in Job 14 or in Genesis 37. Now, some biblical writers assume the dead were separated from God, like in Psalm 88 and Isaiah 38, but others believe that God's presence was even in Sheol, as in Psalm 139. And Moses said that God's anger burns like a flame in the deepest, darkest places of Sheol. But visually, Sheol's denizens were mentioned as weak, incorporeal, trembling shades in Job 26, Psalm 88, Isaiah 14. And the realm of Sheol is darkness, shadows, and dust. And Sheol is personified as a voracious and ravenous beast that swallows the living. That's Proverbs 1:27 and Isaiah 5, of which there's no escape. Well, at least until later writers of Isaiah 25 and 26 and Daniel 12, where the writer of Isaiah says that God will one day swallow up death and there will be a resurrection of the dead, and the last verses of Isaiah 66 and the writer of Daniel stating that the faithful will be rewarded with everlasting life, while the rest will experience eternal contempt. Now, that shift is very important, especially if you ascribe to the scholarly consensus of this portion of Isaiah 25 and 26, reaching its final form in the 6th to 5th century BC, Isaiah 66 in the 5th century, and the evidence that Daniel was written in the 2nd century about a 6th century event. Because what we're seeing is that there's a major shift concerning what actually goes on down in Sheol, especially after the return of the Jewish priesthood from exile and the establishment of Jerusalem as the center of the Jewish faith. And soon this afterlife concept, where Sheol is just a place that you go and you die, begins to really develop a lot of depth, with those ruled by conceit and the unjust, the improperly buried, those that are unclean, endure pure misery in Sheol, lamenting their faith, while those who die in God's graces are reunited with their families in Sheol, aka the bosom of Abraham. And that's reflected and taken a step further in the apocryphal book of Maccabees, this belief of Jewish martyrs who died, expecting that after our death in this fashion, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will receive us, and all of our forefathers will praise us. And that's in 4 Maccabees 13. And as time went on during this intertestamental period, various Jewish apocalyptic pieces of literature really began to expound on this concept of afterlife, even taking readers on a journey of what lies beyond, which we'll talk about in the next video when we dive into the biblical concept of Hades. So as you see, when it comes to Sheol, it sure as heck doesn't fit the picture of what we typically think of as hell. And in fact, we see that there was an agreement between writers as to what Sheol actually was. Some believed it was a metaphor or something to be personified. Some believed it was an actual very real place. And there are even extra biblical mentions that Sheol actually was a huge bone of contention between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, aka the Jewish priesthood, who disagreed on resurrection and the afterlife itself. So that's Sheol in the Old Testament. And next video, we're going to turn our attention to this idea of Hades, which begins to pop up and really takes main stage during the intertestamental period and with the early New Testament writers. So stay tuned. It's week 4 of our series on the history of hell and the Christian faith. And today, we're talking about the second word translated as hell in the Bible, the word Hades. And trust me, the interchange of the words hell and Hades has led to loads of confusion for Bible readers over the last few centuries. And today's session might be challenging and eye-opening for you. And again, disclaimer, this series is about the history of hell and the Christian faith and is not about disproving the existence of hell or proving the existence of hell or anything like that. So if you're looking for a turn or burn kind of video, keep on scrolling, because this series is about history. Oh yeah, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time, Jesus-loving, non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history. And I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. So, let's dive deep into Hades.
So you mind running that by me again? I must have a chunk of brimstone wedged in my earth.
Nope, not that Hades. This Hades. In prior videos, we discussed how the word hell in English Bibles was actually translated from 4 separate words that each carried their own meaning and visuals in Jewish and early Christian culture. We talked about the use of Sheol in the Old Testament last week and how Sheol was translated as hell into English. But in the Old Testament, long before Sheol was translated as hell in English. Sheol was translated as Hades in Greek. And in the New Testament, Hades was later translated as hell 11 times in English in 1611 King James, 10 times as hell and 1 time as grave. However, as we discussed in other videos, better translations of the Bible, and even the New King James Version, have now gone back to the original usage of the word Hades. In many of the most well-known mentions of hell that are in the New Testament, such as the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, Jesus saying, "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it," in Matthew 16:18. Jesus' warnings to Capernaum in Matthew 11:23 and Luke 10:15. Peter's first major evangelistic speech in Acts 2:27, and even the centuries later Apostles' Creed, which says Jesus descended into hell, are actually translated from the word Hades. And like the word Sheol in the Old Testament, Hades was where everyone went after death. When you kick the bucket, Hades is where you went. And it may have been where Jesus went after his crucifixion. And even the story of the thief on the cross in Luke 23, whom Jesus promises paradise, makes so much more sense when you understand the role of Hades, aka the unseen realm, in the Jewish mind of 2,000 years ago. So, what's Hades? First, we need to explore a factoid that most folks in church are never taught, and that's the influence of Greek culture on Judaism during the intertestamental period and within early Christianity. Facts are that during the centuries immediately preceding Jesus, most Hebraic people didn't read, write, or even speak Hebrew anymore. If a commoner had any experience with Hebrew, it was usually on the most basic of levels. At the time of Jesus, Hebraic people spoke Aramaic, and outside of Judea, most Jews spoke Greek. And while Hebrew was spoken amongst the elite of Hebraic society, outside of them, most people simply didn't understand the language of the Torah. So when listening to Hebrew scriptures at temple, in Judea, folks would need readings translated to Aramaic. Everywhere else around the Mediterranean, Greek. And while you might go, I don't know, Ken, that sounds weird, just remember, for 1,000 years in Western Europe, the Bible was in Latin, which most Western Europeans didn't speak either. Kind of the same deal. Legend goes in the 3rd century BC, Pharaoh Ptolemy II ordered 72 Jewish translators, 6 each from the 12 tribes of Israel, to translate the Tanakh from Hebrew into Greek. Now there's a lot of doubt about the legitimacy of that legend, but what is known is that Greek translations of the Torah were widespread by the 2nd century BC. And by 132 BC, the remainder of the entirety of the Tanakh was common in Greek, and collectively this Greek Old Testament was called the Septuagint. And it was the Septuagint that was the most commonly read and used version of the scriptures at the time of Christ. This was the version of the Old Testament that people were familiar with and formed the basis of thought, theology, and cosmologies for early New Testament writers, church fathers, and also helped form the earliest Bible translations that we currently have. And in the Septuagint, when it came to translating the word Sheol, which we talked about in the last video as the Jewish underworld where all souls, righteous and unrighteous, went at death, the Greek writers translated that word as Hades in every single case, except 3, Job 24:19, Proverbs 23:14, and Ezekiel 32:21. Now, some of you may be familiar with Hades in Greek mythology. Hades was both the name of the ancient Greek god of the underworld and the name of the shadowy place underneath the earth the dead were sent. And in Greek mythology, at death, souls were ferried to Hades upon the river Styx. And upon arrival at the gates of Hades, guarded by the 3-headed dog Cerberus, souls judged to have led good lives were allowed to drink from the river Lethe and would forget the bad parts of their life and then be taken to the Elysian fields, aka paradise. But if you led a bad life, or were known for offending the gods, you were taken to Tartarus in the depths of Hades and condemned to eternal torment. This is also where the Titans who warred with the Olympian gods were bound as punishment. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, a lot of this ancient Greek mythology was scrapped. But the ancient Israelite concept of Sheol, how it was a shadowy realm where both the souls of the unrighteous and righteous resided, bore many resemblances with Hades. And so in the minds of Greek writers, Sheol and Hades were interchangeable. Now remember, the Bible is a multivocal work. Its many writers had many different influences and ideas of what may lay beyond. But in general, it seems that Hades, in the intertestamental period and in the New Testament, was a place of 2 divisions, a place of blessing and punishment. And this is seen in Matthew 11, Matthew 16, Luke 10, Luke 16, and Acts 2. And remember, Hades is where everyone went. So if you went to the good place, sometimes referred to as the bosom of Abraham. That's where you would rest in peace with your ancestors. And some even believe the concept of paradise was present within Hades as well. Luke 23, thief on the cross. Anyone? Bueller. But Hades wasn't just the good place. There was a bad part about the place too, a place of torment and maybe even flames, according to Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Luke 16 even suggests that it was the angels who carry souls to where they were going in Hades, and that there's this massive chasm that separates the two places that is impossible to cross, but the tormented can see those enjoying rest. Now, some argue that this story in Luke 16 was just a parable that Jesus was using as a metaphor to talk about how earthly possessions and pleasures are of no benefit in the afterlife, and how Jesus was foreshadowing how some people wouldn't believe even if someone demonstrably came back from the dead. And others say Jesus was being very literal here. And honestly, how you interpret that, well, that's all going to depend on your interpretation and orthodoxy or denominational tradition. But what we do know, and is a fact, is that the idea of Hades being a place of peace and or punishment was widely understood by both Jewish hearers at that time and later Christians of the first centuries. And this is where it gets kind of complicated, and honestly, a lot depends on your religious tradition, how you interpret a major event in Christianity. And that is, what the heck happened to Jesus after the crucifixion, where he went, and what happened because of it. Because some interpret scriptures such as Matthew 12:40, Acts 2:24, Acts 2:31, Ephesians 4:9 through 10, Colossians 1:18, 1 Peter 3:18 and 19, and 1 Peter 4:6 as referring to Jesus descending into the earth to the dead, ministering to the dead. And all of this makes sense when you understand what Hades was to these cultures, that it was a place for the righteous and unrighteous. And according to Jesus himself in Revelation 1:17 through 18, he even comes slamming with the ultimate mic drop, "Do not be afraid, I am the first and the last and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades." And let's not forget 1 Corinthians 15:55, which refers to the Septuagint version of Hosea 13:14. "I will deliver them out of the power of Hades, and I will redeem them from death. Where is thy penalty, O death? O Hades, where is thy sting?" But however and whatever you think about Hades, it's not something that is meant to last forever. Revelations 20:13 says death and Hades will give up its occupants, and Revelation 20:14 says Hades will eventually be thrown into a lake of fire, the second death. Whew, that's a lot of stuff. But we're not done with Hades. We'll come back to it much later in this series and talk about the impact of Hades on early church belief and the Apostles' Creed, but that's later. Because we're not done with the words translated as hell in the Bible. Next video, we're going to talk about another interesting word translated as hell, and that is Tartarus, which brought up a whole bunch of imagery for both Jews and Christians of the ancient world that's pretty lost on us today. So stick around. It's going to be a scorcher. Quick, envision hell in your mind. What do you see? Flames, tortures, maniacal demons, utter darkness, being hung upside down by your tippy toes while being forced to watch unending episodes of the 5th season of Arrested Development? Seriously, I really hate what they did to that show. Well, if you've been watching this series on the history of hell and the Christian faith, and a lot of you have, we're cracking on. And today we're talking about something/somewhere that puzzles many modern Bible readers. Tartarus!
Tartar sauce, tartar sauce, tartar sauce. Tartar sauce, tartar sauce, tartar.
No, not tartar sauce. Tartarus! Out of the 4 words translated as hell in the English Bible, Tartarus is only mentioned once. But in its one use, oh baby, it makes an impression and brings up loads of questions. And extra biblically, in texts that were important to the early church that didn't make the final canonical cut, so to speak, Tartarus was a big, big deal. Ever hear of the Watchers or the Nephilim? Oh yeah, today is gonna be a doozy. And hi, my name's Ken. I'm a full-time Jesus-loving non-traditional missionary that's been abroad for 5 years. I'm also a researcher and teacher that seriously digs history, especially ancient religious history. And I teach classes online too. You should check them out in my profile. So, tartar sauce. It's gross. I don't like it. And I don't think I'd like Tartarus either. The one mention of Tartarus in the English Bible comes from 2 Peter 2:4. For if God didn't spare the angels who sinned, but threw them down into Tartarus and delivered them to be kept in chains of darkness until judgment. And Tartarus is kind of used like a verb, as in throw down or throw to Tartarus. Now, 2 Peter 2 is referring to false prophets who have arisen in the church who are denying the sovereignty of Christ, indulging in sexual sin, and exploiting Christians. And 2 Peter is saying, look, God knows what's up, don't worry. They're going to get theirs, and God's going to both rescue his people and punish their unrighteous at exactly the right time until the final and ultimate reckoning, which will occur on the day of judgment. And uses the example of angels who sin that have been thrown down and are in captivity until judgment to prove his point. But this opens up a whole can of worms to modern believers. What the heck is Tartarus? And why does it just randomly show up here? And hold up. Why are there angels chained up in it? Who the heck are they? Why are these guys chained up, but Satan and his loonies are loose in the world? And why are they chained in darkness and not being barbecued like rotisserie chickens? When you think about it, this Tartarus thing is way out of left field until you learn what the ancient Christians knew about Tartarus and who dwelled in it. So, what's Tartarus? Well, if you watched the last video on Hades and the video on Sheol, you will remember me talking about the influence of Greek culture on Jewish culture during the intertestamental period and the early Christian church. And if you haven't watched those videos, come on, what's wrong with you? Watch them videos! And like Hades, which was translated as hell 10 times in the King James New Testament, Tartarus comes to us courtesy of the ancient Greeks. And one of the first known references to Tartarus comes from the Greek poet Hesiod in the 8th century BC, where he wrote that Tartarus was the third of the primordial gods. But over time, like Hades, Tartarus became associated with the place, not just a god. And Tartarus was a place nobody wanted to go. Ancient Greeks believed that if it took an anvil 9 days to fall from heaven to earth, it would take 9 more days for an anvil to fall from the earth to the depths of Tartarus. Homer took it a step farther and said that Tartarus is as far beneath Hades as heaven is above earth. Basically, Tartarus was deep in the bowels of Hades, just down up in there like a piece of chewing gum you swallowed in the 8th grade. I mean, just down in there. And if Hades had a good place, like we discussed last week, Tartarus was the best of the bad places that you could be. In Greek mythology, after the Olympian gods warred with the Titans, the defeated Titans were banished and chained in Tartarus for eternity. And the Romans had a thing for Tartarus too. The Aeneid gives tons of details on Tartarus, that it was deep and massive, surrounded by triple walls and a river of fire called the Phlegethon, guarded by a 50-mouthed hydra. And inside Tartarus there was this massive castle with iron turrets, and inside the castle was a pit that went down even further, and at the gloomy bottom in chain were the twin giants Otis and Ephialtes, who had made war upon the god. Now this is starting to sound like the hell that movies envision, right? So, there's your basics on Tartarus outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as we talked about in the last 2 videos, Greco-Roman culture had a massive impact on Jewish culture during the intertestamental period and during Jesus' day. This is historically undeniable. And this shows up in the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which was the version of the scriptures that formed the basis for the early church. In the Septuagint, the word Tartarus shows up in Job 40:20 and 41:24, which in our Old Testament now shows up as Job 40:13 as imprisoned in the grave, and 41:31 as the deep, as the verses are numbered different in the Septuagint. Greek translators use the word Tartarus to describe a deep, dark place in the earth. But extra biblically, in the book of Enoch, dated between the 3rd to 1st century BC, which was crazy popular during the intertestamental period and among early Christians, it says in 1 Enoch 20 that God put the angel Uriel in charge of the world and of Tartarus. And it was in Tartarus that 200 fallen angels, the Watchers, who led by Semyaza, rebelled against God and taught humanity the use of weapons and sorcery, and who ended up lusting after women, mating with them, and creating the race of Nephilim, were imprisoned in chains. These guys aren't resting like those in the bosom of Abraham, you know what I mean? So, Tartarus isn't hell as we commonly think about it, but it's a bad place. And amongst many Jews prior to Jesus and among early Christians, Tartarus was a deep, dark, terrifying place where the angels who rebelled against God, who some believe mated with women and created the Nephilim, were imprisoned to await final judgment at the end of days. And these are the angels most likely referenced in Jude 1:6-7 and 2 Peter 2:4. Now, don't hear what I am not saying. I am not saying Enoch is inspired literature, nor does it belong in the Bible. Don't put words in my mouth that I ain't saying. But the books of Enoch did have a lot of influence during the intertestamental period in early Christianity, and it was widely read within both Jewish and Greek communities. But as some folks don't like to fathom the influence of Enoch on the early church, and I completely get that, there's another way to look at 2 Peter's use of Tartarus, and that's simply 2 Peter was written in Greek, and it was written for Greek speakers. Thus, it uses imagery and language as a parallel for those who either A, knew the story of the Titans in Tartarus, or B, were an audience of ancient Greek speakers who knew that Tartarus was a place for the extremely wicked and could make the connection. But one thing we know about Tartarus for sure is that in early Christian belief, as reflected in the canonized New Testament, Tartarus was not a place for humans. It was for a very specific group of angels. But in later Gnostic works, Tartarus becomes a place for humans as well. So one mere word, Tartarus, that was translated as hell in 2 Peter 2:4, when you really dig into it, opens up this really amazing rabbit hole into the minds of early believers. So whether you want to look at 2 Peter 2:4 as a literal reference to this Greek idea of an underworld within an underworld where the most offensive to God are kept chained in darkness awaiting judgment, maybe those who rebelled and mated with women creating the Nephilim, or as an offhand reference to a Greek-speaking audience who would catch the implications, Tartarus is a fascinating hole to fall into. Had to do it. So next episode, we're going to tackle the flames of Gehenna, which Jesus mentioned 11 times. So it might just be important. See you there. When I say the word hell, what pops into your brain? Eternal flames, being separated from God for all time? Or do you believe hell is a place made up to control the masses? If you've been watching this series on the history of hell in the Christian faith, this is the episode you've been waiting for. Today we're discussing a word that struck absolute fear into the heart of many intertestamental Jews and many early Christians. Gehenna. And remember, this series on hell is not meant to prove or disprove the existence of hell, nor is this a turn or burn sermon. This is about the history of hell in the Christian faith, using facts and history to deepen our understanding of just what exactly it was that the writers of the Bible were referring to. And this episode might just set you on fire. Ooh, terrible analogy. But this episode is going to upset the apple cart for a lot of folks. So check your cognitive dissonance and get ready, because the history on this one is going deep. When it comes to hell, which remember is translated from 4 different words in the Bible, Gehenna stands unique. Gehenna is the one term used to depict the ultimate destiny of the wicked. And Jesus is the one who primarily uses this term in the Gospels. And it also makes one appearance in the book of James. So, what's Gehenna? Gehenna is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Gehinnom. In the Old Testament, it's a place name of a specific valley southwest of Jerusalem. 2 Kings 23 refers to it as the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom, of the son of Hinnom in Jeremiah 19, or of Hinnom in Nehemiah 11:30. And you can even tour it today, but there's no crazy fires or anything. It's a rather lovely place. And geographically, it's used 13 times in the Hebrew Bible, in Joshua 15 and 18 as a geographical place, in 2 Kings 23, 2 Chronicles 28 and 33, and Jeremiah 32 is reference to historical events that happened there. And pay attention, it's mentioned 5 times in Jeremiah and prophecies where God will punish those who have abandoned the Israelite faith, and it's the valley referred to in Jeremiah 31 and Isaiah 66. Now, in the Old Testament, why is this valley mentioned so much? Because Gehenna had a rather dark, ugly history. In 2 Chronicles 28, we see the Judaic king Ahaz establish pagan sacrifices in the valley of Gehenna, where children were passed through the fire, with Jewish tradition saying that they were burned alive. And 2 Kings 16:3 says Ahaz even sacrificed his own sons there. And 2 generations later, King Manasseh did the same in 2 Kings 21. 2 generations after that, King Josiah arrives on the scene and initiates vast reforms in 2 Kings 23 to purify the land and centralize worship in Jerusalem. And one of his targets was the Valley of Gehenna, which had come to be known as the place of fire. And part of Josiah's reforms, he's recorded as scattering human bones at pagan sites to defile them. And 2 Chronicles records Josiah as burning the bones of dead pagan priests on their altars, cleansing Judah and Jerusalem from their sin. But the memory of what happened in the Valley of Gehenna didn't just vanish, and later prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah made loads of visual callbacks to this valley because it was powerful imagery for a people who loved visual imagery. Gehenna is strongly alluded to in Isaiah 66, which, if you know your links between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you know Isaiah 66 was a favorite of Jesus in his teachings. And Isaiah 66 depicts a future battle outside Jerusalem where God protects the righteous inside the city while destroying the wicked with fire and sword, with the righteous observing the dead bodies in the valley where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. This imagery is undeniably connected to Jeremiah portraying a terrible battle where the dead are left unburied and consumed by scavengers. And this theme is further linked to the Valley of Slaughter in Jeremiah as expressed in Isaiah 30, where it refers to the great day of slaughter associated with Israel's salvation and the defeat of her enemies on the day of the Lord. Whew! Now, you might be saying, what does any of that have to do with hell? I'm glad you asked. In Hebraic consciousness, Gehenna was the place of fire, death, and utter annihilation. It was cursed. And, come closer, this might upset you, but let me use this chance to address a well-known myth that's shared as truth even in a number of study Bibles, that Gehenna became a garbage dump outside of the city of Jerusalem where refuse, trash, and even dead bodies were thrown into and buried. That's a myth. Because, number one, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence of Gehenna being used as a garbage dump. Number two, there are no ancient attestations of Gehenna being a garbage dump. And number three, the earliest mention anyone can find of Gehenna being a burning garbage dump comes from a Jewish rabbi around 1200 AD named David Kimchi in his commentary to Psalm 27. That's right. The earliest reference to Gehenna as a garbage dump came 1,200 years after Jesus. But Gehenna, aka Gehenna, was full of powerful imagery for ancient Jews. And during the intertestamental period and the rise of apocalyptic literature that became popular at that time, and as the Hebraic views of the afterlife took on greater depth that we've discussed in this series, Gehenna was a cursed place of child sacrifice and prophetic judgment and battles and death. But in many Jewish sects, Gehenna evolved to represent a place of continued torment after death. And that idea of continued or eternal torment continued to deepen well after Christ, as demonstrated in pseudepigraphal writings such as the Apocalypse of Abraham and Tu Baruch, and even centuries later in the Mishnah and Talmud, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. So, historically, and just like the other three words translated as hell, there's a shift in the understanding of what Gehenna actually was. It began as a geographical place with a dark history that soon came to represent something even more powerful through Jeremiah, Isaiah, and later apocalyptic writers. And this makes total sense when you understand that the Bible is a multivocal work spanning books that were written over a 1,000-year period. And again, this is not saying that there's no hell or anything like that, but what I am saying is that the understanding of Gehenna, as reflected in ancient sources, can and did change. This is an undeniable fact. Now, all that history stuff aside, let's talk about how Jesus referenced Gehenna, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. Jesus mentions Gehenna 11 times. It's mentioned in Matthew 8 times, Mark 3 times in one chapter, and Luke once. And when Jesus uses the word Gehenna, Jesus isn't referencing a mythical garbage dump, but he is masterfully invoking the powerful imagery established by Gehenna's history and Old Testament allusions in Isaiah and Jeremiah to describe the fate of the wicked upon God's final judgment. And let me tell you, it worked, because here we are 2,000 years later, still talking about it. But when you understand the history of Gehenna and the way that ancient Jews historically and metaphorically understood it and its references, all of a sudden things make more sense. But let's get back to Jesus. When Jesus used the term Gehenna, there's something we often miss. Go back and look at Matthew 5:22, 5:29, 5:30, Matthew 10:28, Matthew 18:9, Mark 9:43, 9:45, 9:47, and Luke 12:5. And notice how Jesus employs the use of Gehenna. It's uniquely linked to the body. Its use in Matthew and Mark describes it as a place where sinners face consequences, using vivid imagery of mutilated body parts. Mark 9:43 advises cutting off a sinful hand, stating it's better to be maimed than to go into Gehenna. Jesus extends this metaphor to feet and eyes, creating a comparison between losing a body part and the total loss represented by Gehenna. And the message is clear: address and recognize your sin, or it will lead to your complete destruction. And he uses these references from Isaiah and Jeremiah to pull this point home for his Jewish audience. And Jesus' use of Gehenna's imagery draws from the scenes of devastation in Jeremiah's valley of slaughter and Isaiah's battle and resulting massacre. And Jesus, quoting Isaiah 66, intertwines these images of an unquenchable fire and undying worms to paint a grim picture of this complete and final destruction. And this fire is described as unquenchable or irresistible, fully consuming and reducing everything to nothing, burning up what it touches. And references there are Ezekiel 20:47-48, Amos 5:5-6, and Matthew 3:12. It's chilling imagery of the inevitability and thoroughness of God's destruction of wickedness and evil. And Luke 12:4-5 also emphasizes the body, and Matthew 10:28 highlights God's control over life and death. The concept of Gehenna, therefore, it's complex, it's culturally rich, it's a symbol of utter destruction, and Jesus evokes it powerfully into full effect. So, there are your 4 words translated as hell, and what they really meant to ancient hearers. Now, what does that mean to early Christian audiences, and how should we as modern readers and doers receive this today? Are evildoers destined to burn forever in agony, or will they simply be annihilated? Do you believe in eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, free will, or universal reconciliation? There are no easy answers there, and a lot of your beliefs depend on your faith tradition. Like I said, the series isn't about proving or disproving the existence of hell, but it is meant to provide you the historical context of what hell has meant through the ages. So, I'm curious, what do you believe about hell? I'll go through your comments and reply with a few videos with historic context to any questions that you might have. So, God bless, and I'll see you soon. Crazy thanks to everyone who attended the Truth About Hell, A Believer's Guide online workshop last week. We were at max registration for that 3.5-hour workshop as we went deep into the history of hell and the Christian faith. And man, it was a blast. Some people's minds just got blown. And the feedback from the workshop has been amazing, and I'm really touched by all your heartfelt comments. And for those that missed the workshop and would like to check it out, it is available for download in both video and audio formats. Just check out my linky dinky doo in my profile, click the button, and sign on up. You may have seen the video series I've done on the history of hell and the Christian faith, but this workshop went way deeper than those 6 to 8 minute videos. We covered topics like earlier beliefs of the afterlife beliefs of cultures that surrounded the Hebrews and their different ideas, the 4 words and alternate words translated as hell in the English Bible, the origin of the word hell and the implications of that, how Jesus used the words Gehenna and Hades and the meanings in the way that he did that, different ways Christian traditions view hell and damnation, differences in early church views about hell and the views we hold today due to the cultural impact and influences of medieval and Renaissance artists have had on the modern ideas about hell, and even compared and contrasted ideas like eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, conditionalism, and even universal reconciliation, ripping out the untruths and leading folks into a deeper understanding of the role of hell in Christian belief. And most importantly, we discussed where the love of Jesus is and all that, which is a question I find folks have a very hard time answering until they tap into some of the truths revealed through history in this workshop. All told, the workshop and the Q&A went 3.5 hours, but it went by fast. And if you would like to join in, like I said, it's not too late. Just go to my link, register, and you'll be able to download the workshop and watch it whenever you want. And if you sign up over the next few days, it will also include a free digital copy of my new book, Rending the Veil, Beginning the Journey of Intimacy with Your Creator. All for signing up. So to register, I'm asking for a small trade-in, which you can donation, with all proceeds going to our overseas mission and charity work, details of which can be found in my profile. And once again, thanks for joining in on the workshop. It was a ton of fun, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. God bless.